The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military base in Afghanistan. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead as she reviewed the security protocols for the 100th time that week. As a civilian contractor working alongside the Marines, she took her job seriously. Her role was to ensure that every safety measure was in place before the troops went out on their missions. Sarah had always been driven by a sense of duty. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she watched her father serve in the Army for 20 years. She remembered the pride in his eyes when he wore his uniform, and the stories he told about helping people in distant lands. Though she never enlisted herself, Sarah found her way to serve through her expertise in security systems and logistics. The morning started like any other. The Marines were preparing for a routine patrol through a nearby village. Sarah walked through the motor pool, checking each vehicle with meticulous care. She tested communication devices, verified that medical supplies were properly stocked, and ensured that every piece of protective equipment met the highest standards. The Marines knew her well by now. They called her Safety Sarah with affection, though some of the younger ones occasionally grumbled about her. Thoroughness Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez approached her with a friendly smile. He was leading today's patrol and wanted to go over the route one more time. Sarah spread out the map on the hood of a Humvee, pointing out potential hazards she had identified from intelligence reports. Rodriguez listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. He respected her dedication and knew that her attention to detail had probably saved lives more than once. As the convoy prepared to roll out, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. One of the vehicles had a slight irregularity in its tire pressure reading. It was minor, barely noticeable, but Sarah's instinct told her to investigate further. She called over Corporal James Peterson, the vehicle's driver, and explained her concern. He seemed impatient at first, eager to get moving with his unit, but Sarah insisted. Together, they examined the tire more closely. What Sarah discovered made her blood run cold. There was a small puncture, nearly invisible, that could have caused a blowout during the mission. In the rough terrain they would be traveling through, a sudden tire failure could be catastrophic. It could send the vehicle off the road, leave the Marines vulnerable to attack, or worse. Sarah immediately ordered the tire changed. Despite protests about the delay, while the maintenance crew worked on replacing the tire, Sarah continued her inspections. She moved from vehicle to vehicle, her clipboard in hand, checking off items on her list. The heat was oppressive, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She had been working since before dawn, skipping breakfast in her rush to complete the pre-mission checks. Sarah steadied herself against a vehicle and took a deep breath, determined to finish her job. The Marines were getting restless. They had a schedule to keep, and every delay meant adjusting their timeline. Sarah understood their frustration, but she would not compromise on safety. She had seen too many reports of what happened when corners were cut, when someone assumed everything would be fine. Her father had taught her that in military operations, assumptions could be deadly. As Sarah climbed up to inspect the roof-mounted equipment on one of the vehicles, she felt her vision blur. The metal surface was scorching hot under the midday sun, radiating heat that seemed to envelop her completely. She tried to focus on the communication antenna she needed to check, but her hands were shaking. Sarah knew something was wrong with her body, but the mission came first. She had to make sure everything was secure. Rodriguez noticed her struggling and called up to her, asking if she was all right. Sarah waved him off, insisting she was fine. She was always fine. She had to be fine because these Marines depended on her expertise to keep them safe. The thought of one of them getting hurt because she had not done her job properly was unbearable to her. Sarah finished checking the antenna and began to climb down from the vehicle. Her foot found the first step, then the second. But as she reached for the third, the world suddenly tilted. The combination of heat, dehydration, and exhaustion finally overwhelmed her body. Her vision went dark and she felt herself falling. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but her fingers would not respond. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was someone shouting her name. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion. Sarah's body tumbled from the vehicle and she hit the ground hard. The impact sent dust flying into the air around her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze on the base. Then chaos erupted as Marines rushed toward her fallen form. Rodriguez was the first to reach her side. He dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse and calling for the medic. Other Marines formed a protective circle around Sarah, shielding her from the sun with their own bodies. They owed this woman their lives, though she probably did not realize it. How many times had her careful inspections caught problems that could have turned deadly? How many times had she stayed late, working through the night to make sure they had everything they needed? The base medic, Petty Officer 2nd Class Jennifer Chen, arrived within seconds. She quickly assessed Sarah's condition, noting the signs of heat exhaustion and possible dehydration. Sarah's skin was hot and dry, her breathing shallow. Chen immediately began treatment, starting an IV line and moving Sarah into the shade. The medic worked with practiced efficiency, but her face showed concern. Sarah's condition was serious. As word spread across the base, Marines began gathering around the medical area. They waited anxiously for news about the woman who had dedicated herself to their safety. Many of them had never really thought about what Sarah risked every day. She was not carrying a weapon or going out on patrols. But she was there in the heat and danger, working tirelessly to protect them. Inside the medical tent, Sarah remained unconscious. Her body had simply given out after weeks of pushing herself too hard. She had been working 12 to 14-hour days in extreme heat, often forgetting to eat or drink enough water. Her dedication had finally taken its toll. And now she lay motionless on a cot while Marines who barely knew her name stood vigil outside. Chen worked to stabilize Sarah's vital signs while radioing for guidance from the main hospital at Bagram Airfield. She administered fluids and monitored Sarah's temperature closely. The next few hours would be critical. Heat exhaustion could quickly turn into heat stroke, and the consequences could be severe. All they could do now was wait and hope that Sarah's body would respond to treatment. Outside, Rodriguez stood with his arms crossed, watching the medical tent with worried eyes. The patrol had been postponed indefinitely. None of the Marines felt right about leaving while Sarah was fighting for her life. She had been watching over them for months, and now it was their turn to watch over her. The hours passed slowly as Sarah remained unconscious in the medical tent. Petty Officer Chen never left her side, constantly monitoring her patient's vital signs and adjusting treatment as needed. The 4 fluids were helping, and Sarah's temperature was gradually decreasing, but she showed no signs of waking up. Chen had seen cases like this before, and she knew that recovery could take time. The body needed to heal from the trauma of extreme heat, exposure, and exhaustion. Outside the tent, the atmosphere on the base had shifted dramatically. The Marines who had been so eager to leave on their patrol now found themselves unable to focus on anything except Sarah's condition. Small groups gathered throughout the base, sharing stories about her. Many of them had interactions with Sarah that they had taken for granted at the time. But now those memories took on new meaning. Sergeant David Cooper told anyone who would listen about the time. Sarah had caught a faulty clasp on his body armor during an inspection. He had been annoyed at the time, thinking she was being overly cautious. But later that same day, during a firefight, his vest took a direct hit from shrapnel. If that clasp had failed, the armor would not have protected him properly. Sarah's attention to detail had likely saved his life, and he had never even thanked her. Private First Class Amanda Torres shared her own story. She was new to the unit and nervous about her first mission outside the wire. Sarah had noticed her anxiety and spent an extra hour going over all the safety equipment, explaining how everything worked and why it mattered. Torres remembered how Sarah's calm demeanor and thorough explanations had helped settle her nerves. That kindness had meant everything to a scared young Marine far from home. The stories kept coming, one after another. Sarah had touched more lives than anyone realized. She was not the type to seek recognition or praise. She simply did her job with absolute dedication, day after day, in conditions that would break most people. The Marines were beginning to understand that they had a hero among them, someone who embodied the values of service and sacrifice. Just as much as any uniformed service member, Lieutenant Rodriguez sat in his office, struggling with guilt. He had noticed Sarah was not looking well that morning, but he had been so focused on the mission timeline that he had not insisted she take a break. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over. If he had paid more attention, if he had ordered her to rest, maybe this would not have happened. The weight of command felt heavier than ever. As evening approached, Rodriguez made a decision. He contacted the base commander, Colonel William Harrison, and requested a meeting. When he entered Harrison's office, the colonel looked up from the reports on his desk with concern in his eyes. Harrison had already heard about Sarah's collapse and was following her condition closely. Rodriguez stood at attention and made his case. He explained that Sarah's dedication had gone beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from a civilian contractor. She had worked tirelessly to keep Marines safe, often at the expense of her own well-being. Rodriguez believed that her service deserved recognition, not just from their unit, but from the entire Marine Corps. Harrison listened carefully, nodding occasionally as the lieutenant spoke. The colonel had his own memories of Sarah's work. He remembered reading incident reports from other bases where contractors had cut corners or failed to maintain standards. But every report that crossed his desk about Sarah Mitchell praised her professionalism and dedication. She had set a standard of excellence that exceeded even many of the military personnel on the base. Harrison agreed with Rodriguez's assessment. Sarah deserved recognition for her service. But as he explained to the lieutenant, military awards and decorations were typically reserved for service members. Civilian contractors occupied a complicated space in the military hierarchy. They were essential to operations but outside the traditional command structure. Finding the right way to honor Sarah would require creativity and coordination. The two men discussed options late into the evening. They wanted to do something meaningful, something that would show Sarah how much her work had mattered. As they talked, an idea began to form. It would take coordination and approval from higher headquarters. But if they could pull it off, it would be something Sarah would never forget. Meanwhile, in the medical tent, Sarah's eyes finally fluttered open. The world came into focus slowly, and she found herself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Her mouth was dry, and her head pounded with a dull ache. She tried to sit up, but felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. Pressing her back down, Chen's face appeared above her, smiling with relief. The medic explained what had happened and where Sarah was. As the memories came flooding back, Sarah's first thought was about the mission. She tried to ask if the patrol had left safely, if all the vehicles had been properly checked. Chen reassured her that everything was fine and told her that the mission had been postponed. Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had delayed an important mission because she had not taken care of herself properly. In her mind, she had failed in her duty. Chen seemed to sense what Sarah was thinking and gently corrected her. The Marines had postponed the mission by choice, the medic explained, because they were worried about her. Sarah had not failed anyone. If anything, she had pushed herself too hard trying to protect others. Over the next few hours, Sarah's condition continued to improve. Chen kept her on for fluids and insisted she rest, despite Sarah's protests that she needed to get back to work. The medic was firm, explaining that heat exhaustion was serious and that rushing recovery could lead to complications. Sarah reluctantly agreed to follow medical advice, though her mind was already racing ahead to the inspections and checks that needed to be completed. Word spread quickly that Sarah was awake and recovering. Marines began stopping by the medical tent to check on her, though Chen limited visitors to avoid overwhelming her patient. Each visitor brought the same message of gratitude and concern. Sarah was surprised and somewhat embarrassed by the attention. She had just been doing her job, nothing more. But to the Marines, she had been doing much more than that. Rodriguez visited late that evening, pulling up a chair beside Sarah's cot. He thanked her for catching the tire problem that morning and apologized for not noticing that she was unwell. Sarah tried to brush off his concerns, but Rodriguez would not let her minimize what she had done. He looked her in the eye and told her plainly that her work had saved lives, probably more than she would ever know. The lieutenant also mentioned, somewhat cryptically, that Colonel Harrison wanted to speak with her when she was feeling better. Sarah was puzzled but too tired to press for details. Rodriguez smiled mysteriously and told her to focus on recovering. Everything else could wait. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, she thought about the strange day. She had woken up that morning thinking it would be routine, just another day of inspections and safety checks. Instead, she had ended up here, being treated like she had done something extraordinary. but she had just been doing what her father had taught her, serving others to the best of her ability. That was not extraordinary. That was just the right thing to do. What Sarah did not know was that, across the base, plans were already in motion. Colonel Harrison had made calls to higher headquarters explaining the situation and making a special request. The response had been positive, enthusiastic even. Now it was just a matter of coordination and timing. They wanted to do this right, to give Sarah the recognition she deserved in a way that honored both her service and the Marines she had protected. 3 days had passed since Sarah's collapse, and she was finally cleared to leave the medical tent. Chen had been a strict but caring guardian, ensuring that Sarah rested properly and stayed hydrated. The medic had also given Sarah a stern lecture about recognizing the signs of heat, exhaustion, and the importance of self-care. Sarah listened and promised to do better, though part of her mind was already thinking about all the work that had piled up during her absence. When Sarah stepped out of the medical tent into the morning sunlight, she was surprised by what she saw. A small group of Marines stood waiting for her, led by Lieutenant Rodriguez. They broke into spontaneous applause as she emerged, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She was not used to being the center of attention and did not quite know how to respond to their warm welcome. Rodriguez approached her with a smile and explained that Colonel Harrison wanted to see her in his office. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with her work? The lieutenant seemed to sense her concern and reassured her that everything was fine. The colonel simply wanted to discuss her recovery and future duties as they walked across the base together. Sarah noticed that Marines kept stopping to greet her. Some nodded respectfully, others called out words of encouragement, and a few even saluted her, though she was a civilian. The attention was overwhelming and confusing. She'd been working on this base for 6 months, often feeling invisible as she went about her safety inspections. Now suddenly everyone seemed to know who she was. When they reached the administrative building, Rodriguez held the door open for her. Inside, the air conditioning was a welcome relief from the desert heat. They walked down a corridor lined with photographs of Marines in various operations, and Sarah found herself thinking about her father. He would have loved to see her here, serving alongside these brave men and women. Even if she was not wearing a uniform, Colonel Harrison's office was neat and organized. With an American flag standing in one corner and various military memorabilia displayed on the walls, the colonel stood up from behind his desk as Sarah entered, and she was struck by the warmth in his expression. He invited her to sit down and asked how she was feeling. Sarah gave him an honest assessment, admitting that she still felt a bit weak, but was eager to return to full duty. Harrison listened carefully, and leaned back in his chair. He told Sarah that he had been reviewing her work over the past 6 months, and he was impressed by her dedication and professionalism. Sarah thanked him politely, unsure where this conversation was heading. The colonel continued, explaining that he had received reports from multiple Marine officers praising her attention to detail and her unwavering commitment to keeping the troops safe. Then Harrison dropped a bombshell. He told Sarah that he had submitted a special commendation request to higher headquarters on her behalf. While civilian contractors could not receive traditional military awards, there were other ways to recognize exceptional service. Sarah was stunned. She tried to protest that she was just doing her job, but Harrison held up his hand to stop her. The colonel explained that what Sarah considered just doing her job went far beyond standard contract requirements. She had worked longer hours than required in dangerous conditions, and had caught multiple safety issues that could have resulted in Marine casualties. Her dedication had not gone unnoticed, and it would not go unrewarded. Harrison told her that in 2 weeks there would be a special ceremony on the base. She would be the guest of honor. Sarah left the colonel's office in a daze. A ceremony, guest of honor. It all seemed surreal. She had never sought recognition for her work. Service was its own reward, just as her father had always taught her. But as she walked back across the base, she could not help but feel a sense of pride. Not pride in herself necessarily, but pride in being part of something larger than herself, in contributing to the mission in a meaningful way. Over the following days, Sarah gradually returned to her regular duties. Though Chen had imposed strict limits on her working hours and mandated regular breaks, Sarah found that her relationship with the Marines had changed. Where before they had been polite but distant, now they sought her out for conversation. They asked about her recovery, shared stories from their own experiences, and treated her like one of their own, Sergeant Cooper. The Marine, whose body armor she had checked, made it a point to thank her properly. He found her in the motor pool one afternoon and pulled her aside. With genuine emotion in his voice, he told her about the firefight where her inspection had saved his life. Sarah listened with tears in her eyes, realizing for the first time the real impact of her work. These were not just abstract safety procedures. They were the difference between life and death for real people with families and futures. Private Torres also sought Sarah out, bringing her a care package that her mother had sent from home. The young Marine had written to her family about Sarah and how she had helped calm her nerves before her first mission. Torres' mother had insisted on sending something to thank the woman who had looked after her daughter. Sarah was deeply moved by the gesture and the connection it represented. As the days passed, Sarah noticed increased activity around the base. Marines seemed to be preparing for something, but when she asked what was happening, they were evasive. Rodriguez told her not to worry about it, that it was just routine operations. Sarah suspected it had something to do with the ceremony Colonel Harrison had mentioned, but she decided not to pry. She had learned that military operations often involve surprises. What Sarah did not know was that the ceremony being planned was far more elaborate than she could have imagined. Colonel Harrison had not just submitted a commendation request. He had reached out to every unit in the region, explaining Sarah's story and inviting Marines to participate in honoring her service. The response had been overwhelming. Units from across Afghanistan were sending representatives to attend the ceremony. Harrison had also coordinated with the contracting company that employed Sarah, ensuring they understood the significance of what was being planned. The company's regional director was flying in specifically for the event, bringing with him a special recognition from the corporate level. But the most significant element of the ceremony was being kept completely secret. Harrison had made a special request to the commanding general of all Marine forces in Afghanistan. He had asked for something unprecedented, something that had never been done for a civilian contractor. The general had been skeptical at first, but after reviewing Sarah's record and hearing testimony from multiple officers, he had agreed. What they were planning would be a moment that Sarah and everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Rodriguez and the other officers on the base were working overtime to coordinate all the details. They wanted everything to be perfect, to create a ceremony that would truly honor Sarah's sacrifice and dedication. Every Marine on the base had been briefed on their role in the event, and there was a sense of excitement building as the day approached. Sarah remained blissfully unaware of the scale of what was being planned. She continued her daily inspections, grateful to be back at work and feeling stronger each day. She had even started eating breakfast regularly and carrying a water bottle with her everywhere, heeding Chin's advice about taking care of herself. The medic checked on her daily, pleased with her progress and the positive changes in her habits. One afternoon, while Sarah was inspecting a shipment of supplies that had just arrived, she overheard two Marines talking in low voices. They were discussing uniform preparations for the ceremony and mentioning something about formations. Sarah's curiosity was piqued, but when she approached them, they quickly changed the subject. She decided not to press the issue, though she was beginning to suspect that this ceremony might be bigger than she had initially thought. That evening, Rodriguez found Sarah in the dining facility and sat down across from her with his meal tray. He asked casually if she had anything special to wear for the ceremony. Sarah looked at him blankly. She had not really thought about it. She usually wore practical work clothes, appropriate for her duties. Rodriguez suggested that she might want to wear something a bit more formal, maybe dress pants and a nice shirt. Sarah agreed, making a mental note to see what she could find in her limited wardrobe. The morning of the ceremony arrived with clear blue skies and temperatures that were almost comfortable by Afghan standards. Sarah woke early, feeling nervous for reasons she could not quite explain. She had located a pair of dress pants and a professional blouse in her belongings and laid them out carefully. As she prepared for the day, She thought about her father and wished he could be there to see this moment. Chen stopped by Sarah's quarters to check on her one more time before the ceremony. The medic had become something of a friend over the past 2 weeks, and Sarah was grateful for her care and concern. Chen told her she looked nice and that she should try to relax and enjoy the recognition she deserved. Sarah smiled nervously and promised to try. At 10 o'clock, Rodriguez arrived to escort Sarah to the ceremony location. She expected they would be going to one of the administrative buildings, or perhaps a conference room. Instead, Rodriguez led her outside toward the main parade ground. As they approached, Sarah could hear voices and activity, far more than she would have expected for a small ceremony. When they rounded the corner and the parade ground came into view, Sarah stopped in her tracks. The sight before her was overwhelming. The entire parade ground was filled with Marines in their dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation. There were hundreds of them, far more than served on her base alone. Sarah looked at Rodriguez with confusion and shock. He smiled and gently encouraged her to keep walking as they moved closer. Sarah began to understand the magnitude of what she was seeing. These Marines had come from other bases across the region, traveling for hours to be here. They stood at attention in the morning sun, their uniforms crisp and their bearing proud, and they were all here for her. The realization made Sarah's knees weak, and she had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other. A raised platform had been erected at one end of the parade ground, with chairs arranged for dignitaries and a podium with microphones. American flags flanked the platform, moving gently in the breeze. As Sarah and Rodriguez approached, she saw Colonel Harrison standing on the platform along with several other high-ranking officers she did not recognize. One of them wore stars on his uniform, a general. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. Rodriguez guided her to a seat near the front, then took his position with his unit. The formations of Marines stood silently, their eyes forward in military discipline. Sarah sat alone, feeling small and overwhelmed by the scene unfolding around her. She noticed Chen standing with the medical personnel, giving her an encouraging smile. Sergeant Cooper and Private Torres were visible in their respective formations. Both standing tall and proud, Colonel Harrison stepped up to the podium and the ceremony began. His voice carried across the parade ground as he welcomed everyone and explained the purpose of this gathering. He spoke about the nature of service, about the many ways that people contribute to the military mission. He talked about the importance of civilian contractors and the essential work they perform, often in dangerous and difficult conditions. Then Harrison began to tell Sarah's story. He described her arrival at the base 6 months earlier and her immediate impact on safety protocols. He detailed specific instances where her inspections had prevented potential disasters. Harrison spoke about her work ethic, her dedication, and her unwavering commitment to protecting the Marines she served alongside. As he spoke, Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The colonel described the day of Sarah's collapse, how she had pushed herself to exhaustion while ensuring the safety of a Marine patrol. He explained that she had caught a critical tire defect that could have resulted in casualties, and then had continued working despite showing signs of heat exhaustion. Harrison's voice grew emotional as he described how Sarah had literally given everything she had to protect Marines she barely knew. Next, Lieutenant Rodriguez was called to the podium. He stepped up confidently and began to share his perspective on working with Sarah. He described her thoroughness, her expertise, and her absolute refusal to compromise on safety standards no matter how inconvenient or time-consuming. Rodriguez shared the story of the delayed patrol, and how Sarah's insistence on changing that tire had likely saved lives. Several other Marines were then called forward to share their experiences with Sarah. Sergeant Cooper spoke about his body, armor, and the firefight, where his life had been saved by her attention to detail. Private Torres talked about how Sarah had helped calm her fears and prepare her for her first mission. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of Sarah's impact, and each brought fresh tears to her eyes. The regional director from Sarah's contracting company was then introduced. He approached the podium and spoke about the company's pride in Sarah's service. He presented her with a corporate award for outstanding service and announced that she was being promoted within the company with a significant raise in salary. The Marines erupted in applause, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by the generosity and recognition. But the ceremony was far from over. Colonel Harrison returned to the podium and announced that he had a special presentation to make. He called Sarah to come forward, and on shaking legs, she made her way up to the platform. Harrison stood beside her and began to explain that while civilian contractors could not receive traditional military decorations, there was something else that could be done to honor exceptional service. Harrison turned to face the formations of Marines and gave a command. In perfect unison, every single Marine on the parade ground came to attention. The sound of hundreds of heels clicking together echoed across the ground. Then Harrison gave another command, and something unprecedented happened. Every Marine raised their right hand in salute. Holding the position in perfect silence, Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, the hundreds of Marines standing in the sun to honor her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she understood what this meant. The salute was a sign of respect and recognition, a gesture normally reserved for military officers and dignitaries. But these Marines were saluting her, a civilian contractor, because they recognized her as one of their own. The salute seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only a minute. Sarah stood on the platform, trying to memorize every detail of this moment. She saw the pride and respect in the faces before her. She saw Chen wiping away tears. She saw young Marines who had become her friends standing tall and honoring her service. And she felt her father's presence, as if he were there watching his daughter receive the recognition she had never sought but absolutely deserved. When the salute finally ended and the Marines returned to attention, Harrison turned to Sarah. He presented her with a framed certificate of appreciation, signed by the commanding general of Marine forces in Afghanistan. The certificate recognized her exceptional service and dedication to the safety and welfare of Marines in combat operations. It was a formal acknowledgement that her contributions were valued and appreciated at the highest levels. But Harrison had one more surprise. He explained that the Marines had taken up a collection, contributing from their own pockets to create a special gift for Sarah. He presented her with a shadow box containing the unit patches of every Marine unit represented at the ceremony. In the center was a plaque engraved with words that made Sarah break down completely. To Sarah Mitchell, guardian angel of the Corps. Your vigilance kept us safe. Your dedication inspired us. Your sacrifice humbled us. Semper Fi, Semper Fidelis. Always faithful. The Marine Corps motto, offered to her as a sign that she was considered part of the Marine family. Sarah could not speak. She could barely breathe through her tears. She clutched the shadow box to her chest and looked out at the Marines who had given her this incredible honor. Harrison gently guided Sarah back to the microphone and invited her to say a few words if she felt able. Sarah took a moment to compose herself, wiping her tears and trying to find her voice. When she finally spoke, her words came from the heart. She thanked the Marines for their service and sacrifice. She told them about her father and how he had inspired her to serve. She explained that she had never sought recognition. Knowing they were safe was reward enough. But most importantly, Sarah told them that the honor was hers. To work alongside such brave and dedicated men and women was a privilege she would treasure forever. She promised to continue serving them to the very best of her ability for as long as they would have her. And she thanked them for accepting her into their family, for showing her that service takes many forms and that every contribution matters. When Sarah finished speaking, the parade ground erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. The disciplined formations broke as Marines began to cheer and whistle, showing their appreciation in a way that went beyond military protocol. Colonel Harrison smiled and allowed the celebration to continue for several moments. Before calling everyone back to order, the ceremony concluded with one final gesture. Harrison announced that the base's main security checkpoint, where Sarah had spent countless hours inspecting vehicles and equipment, would be officially renamed Mitchell Gate in her honor. A permanent plaque would be installed there, ensuring that every Marine who passed through would know the story of the civilian contractor who had dedicated herself to their safety. As the formations began to disperse, Marines did not immediately leave. Instead, they approached the platform in groups, waiting for a chance to speak with Sarah personally. For the next 2 hours, She stood there, shaking hands, accepting hugs, and listening to stories from Marines she had never met. Each one had made the journey to be here because they understood the importance of recognizing people who served selflessly. A young corporal from a base 3 hours away told Sarah that her story had inspired him to pay more attention to the civilian contractors at his own installation. He realized that he had been taking their work for granted, never really considering the dedication and expertise they brought to their jobs. Meeting Sarah and hearing her story had changed his perspective, and he promised to carry that lesson forward throughout his career. An older sergeant with multiple deployment ribbons on his uniform shared that he had lost friends in incidents that could have been prevented by better safety protocols. He thanked Sarah for her unwavering commitment to those protocols, explaining that every time she caught a potential problem, she was honoring the memory of those who had been lost to preventable accidents. His words hit Sarah deeply, reminding her why her work mattered so much. Lieutenant Rodriguez stayed close by, acting as Sarah's unofficial handler as the crowds of well-wishers continued. He was beaming with pride, having played a key role in organizing the ceremony. Watching Sarah interact with the Marines, seeing the genuine connections being made, Rodriguez felt confident that every hour of planning had been worth it. This was more than just a ceremony. It was a moment of unity and recognition that would resonate throughout the Marine Corps. Private Torres approached with several of her fellow young Marines, all women who served in various roles across different bases. Torres introduced Sarah to each of them, explaining how Sarah's example had shown them that there were many ways to serve with honor and distinction. These young women saw Sarah as a role model, someone who had earned respect through competence, dedication, and character rather than through rank or position. Chen finally managed to pull Sarah away from the crowds, insisting that she needed to rest and hydrate. The medic had been keeping a watchful eye on her patient throughout the ceremony, concerned that the emotional intensity and physical demands of standing in the sun might be too much too soon after her recovery. Sarah protested weakly, not wanting to seem ungrateful by leaving, but Chen was firm. They compromised by moving to a shaded area where Sarah could sit while still greeting people who wanted to speak with her as the afternoon wore on. The visiting Marines began their journeys back to their respective bases. Each unit formed up and marched off the parade ground, but not before passing by Sarah's position and offering one final salute or wave. Sarah watched them go, still struggling to process everything that had happened. She had woken up that morning expecting a small ceremony, perhaps with her base's personnel in attendance. What she had received instead was something beyond her wildest imagination. That evening, the base held a special dinner in Sarah's honor. The dining facility had been decorated with banners and streamers, and the cooks had prepared a special meal. Sarah sat at the head table alongside Colonel Harrison and the other senior officers who had participated in the ceremony. The atmosphere was relaxed and celebratory, a stark contrast to the formal precision of the morning's events. Marines approached throughout the meal to take photos with Sarah, to share jokes, and to simply enjoy her company. She found herself laughing more than she had in months, the tension and stress of the past weeks melting away in the warmth of genuine camaraderie. For someone who had often felt like an outsider despite her months on the base, this acceptance into the Marine family meant everything. During dessert, several Marines stood up spontaneously to offer toasts to Sarah. Some were heartfelt and serious, speaking about courage and dedication. Others were funny, teasing her about her legendary thoroughness during inspections. Sarah blushed and laughed, enjoying the good-natured ribbing. It reminded her of family dinners with her father and his army buddies. The way military people showed affection through humor and shared experiences. As the evening wound down, Colonel Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. They walked outside into the cool night air, and Harrison told her that he had received messages from the commanding general and other senior leaders expressing their appreciation for her service. The ceremony had generated significant attention within the Marine Corps, and Sarah's story was being shared widely as an example of the kind of dedication and excellence that everyone should aspire to. Harrison also shared something more personal. He told Sarah that in his 30 years of service, he had seen countless acts of courage and devotion to duty. But there was something special about her story. Something that reminded everyone that heroism was not just about combat actions or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it was about showing up every day, doing the hard work that nobody noticed, and refusing to compromise on principles even when it would be easier to look the other way. Sarah thanked the colonel for everything he had done to make the ceremony possible. She admitted that she had been overwhelmed and more than a little embarrassed by the attention, but that she understood now why it mattered. It was not really about her as an individual. It was about recognizing the value of service in all its forms, and about showing appreciation for the people who work behind the scenes to support the mission. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that night, she took a detour past the motor pool where she had collapsed 2 weeks earlier. The vehicles sat silent in the darkness, waiting for their next mission. She thought about all the inspections she had performed, all the small problems she had caught, all the times she had insisted on double-checking something that seemed fine. Each of those moments had seemed insignificant at the time, but together they added up to something meaningful. Sarah looked up at the stars. So much brighter here in the desert than they ever were back home. She thought about her father and imagined him looking down at her with pride. He had taught her that service was its own reward, that doing the right thing mattered even when nobody was watching. Today, hundreds of people had been watching, had been celebrating her dedication. But Sarah knew that tomorrow she would go back to her regular duties, back to the quiet work that nobody noticed. And she was completely fine with that. The shadow box with the unit patches and the engraved plaques sat on her desk, illuminated by moonlight coming through her window. Sarah picked it up and ran her fingers over the patches, each one representing Marines who had taken time to honor her. She read the inscription again. Guardian Angel of the Corps was a title she would carry with humility and pride for the rest of her life. Sleep came easily that night. Despite all the excitement of the day, Sarah dreamed of her father, of him wearing his dress uniform and standing among the Marines at the ceremony. In the dream, he saluted her, his eyes shining with pride. When she woke the next morning, Sarah felt a sense of peace and purpose that had been missing before. She understood now that her work was not just a job. It was a calling, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sun rose over the Afghan desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah dressed in her regular work clothes, grabbed her clipboard and her water bottle, and headed out to begin another day of inspections. The Marines she passed greeted her warmly, and she responded with smiles and waves. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had changed. She was still Sarah Mitchell, the civilian contractor who checked every detail and refused to cut corners. But now, she was also something more. She was Mitchell of Mitchellgate. She was the guardian angel of the Corps. She was a member of the Marine family, bound not by uniform or rank, but by shared values and mutual respect. And as she began her rounds, checking vehicles and equipment with her customary thoroughness, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that her work mattered, that she mattered, and that service in any form was worthy of honor. The story of the ceremony spread beyond the Marine Corps. News outlets picked up on the unprecedented honor given to a civilian contractor, and Sarah found herself receiving messages from people all over the world. Veterans reached out to share their own stories of unsung heroes they had served with. Civilians working in dangerous places wrote to thank her for representing them so well. Parents told her that they were sharing her story with their children as an example of dedication and service. The story of the ceremony spread beyond the Marine Corps. News outlets picked up on the unprecedented honor given to a civilian contractor. And Sarah found herself receiving messages from people all over the world. Veterans reached out to share their own stories of unsung heroes they had served with. Civilians working in dangerous places wrote to thank her for representing them so well. Parents told her that they were sharing her story with their children as an example of dedication and service. Sarah handled the attention with the same grace and humility she brought to everything else. She responded to as many messages as she could, always deflecting praise and instead highlighting the Marines she worked with. She gave interviews when asked, but always used the opportunity to talk about the importance of supporting military personnel and recognizing all the people who contribute to military operations, not just those in combat roles. The contracting company Sarah worked for used her story in their recruiting materials, hoping to attract more people with her level of dedication and expertise. Her promotion came with new responsibilities, including training other contractors who would be deployed to military bases around the world. Sarah embraced this role enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to spread the culture of excellence and safety that she believed in so strongly. But despite all the changes and recognition, Sarah remained fundamentally the same person she had always been. She continued to wake up early, to perform her inspections with meticulous care, and to put the safety of Marines above everything else. The ceremony and the honors had not changed her commitment to service. If anything, they had strengthened her resolve to live up to the example she had set and the title she had been given. 3 months after the ceremony, Sarah received an unexpected message from the Department of Defense. She was being invited to Washington, D.C., to participate in a conference on civilian-military cooperation in combat zones. The organizers had heard about her story and wanted her to speak about her experiences working alongside Marines in Afghanistan. Sarah was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being in the spotlight again. But Colonel Harrison encouraged her to accept. The trip to Washington was Sarah's first time leaving Afghanistan since her deployment began 9 months earlier. As the plane lifted off from Bagram Airfield, she looked down at the desert landscape that had become so familiar. She thought about the Marines still down there, still going out on patrols, still facing danger every day. A part of her felt guilty about leaving, even temporarily. But she knew that sharing her experiences could help improve how civilian contractors and military personnel work together across the entire Department of Defense. Washington, D.C. in springtime was a stark contrast to the Afghan desert. Trees bloomed with flowers, the air was humid rather than dry, and the traffic and crowds reminded Sarah how different life was back in the United States. The conference was being held at a hotel near the Pentagon, and when Sarah arrived, she was surprised to find that her story had preceded her. People recognized her name and wanted to hear about the ceremony and her work. The conference brought together military leaders, government officials, and civilian contractors from various companies and agencies. Sarah attended workshops and panels on topics ranging from security protocols to cultural sensitivity training. She listened to other contractors share their experiences, some positive and some challenging. Many spoke about feeling undervalued or misunderstood by the military personnel they worked with. And Sarah realized how fortunate she had been to serve alongside Marines who appreciated her contributions. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood before an audience of several hundred people and felt the same nervousness she had experienced at the ceremony. But as she began to share her story, the words flowed naturally. She talked about the importance of understanding that everyone on a military base, regardless of their role or uniform status, was part of the same mission. She emphasized that safety was not an inconvenience but a sacred responsibility, that cutting corners could cost lives. Sarah shared specific examples from her work, explaining how she had built trust with Marines by demonstrating competence, consistency, and genuine concern for their well-being. She talked about the importance of communication, of explaining why certain procedures mattered, rather than simply enforcing rules. And she spoke about the need for military leaders to recognize and value the contributions of civilian personnel, to treat them as team members rather than outsiders. The response to her presentation was overwhelming. People lined up afterward to speak with her, to ask questions, and to share their own stories. Several military officers told her they were going to change how they interacted with contractors at their own installations. Contractors thanked her for articulating feelings and experiences they had struggled to express. Conference organizers asked if she would be willing to speak at other events in the future. During a break between sessions, Sarah was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Margaret Chen. She explained that she was Petty Officer Chen's mother, that her daughter had told her all about Sarah. Mrs. Chen had traveled to Washington, specifically to meet Sarah and thank her in person. She explained that her daughter had been inspired by Sarah's dedication and had decided to extend her military service, hoping to continue making a difference in the lives of people like Sarah who served alongside the military. The two women spent an hour talking over coffee, sharing stories about Jennifer Chen and the impact she had made as a medic. Mrs. Chen showed Sarah photos of her daughter receiving a Navy Achievement Medal for her work in Afghanistan, and Sarah felt proud knowing that she had played a small role in inspiring such a dedicated young service member. They exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, forming a bond that went beyond their connection through Jennifer. On her last day in Washington, Sarah was invited to visit the Pentagon. Senior official from the Office of the Secretary of Defense wanted to meet with her to discuss ways to improve civilian contractor integration into military operations. Sarah was nervous about the meeting but determined to use the opportunity to advocate for better support and recognition for all the contractors serving in combat zones around the world. The official, a retired Army general named Patricia Morrison, greeted Sarah warmly and listened intently as she shared her observations and recommendations. Morrison explained that the Department of Defense was developing new policies regarding civilian contractors, and that Sarah's input would be valuable in shaping those policies. They discussed everything from safety training to mental health support to recognition programs. Sarah suggested that military bases create more opportunities for interaction between service members and contractors, helping to break down barriers and build mutual respect. She proposed that contractor performance evaluations include input from military personnel they worked with, creating accountability and encouraging excellence. And she advocated for the creation of formal recognition programs that would honor exceptional civilian service in a meaningful way. Morrison took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions throughout their conversation. As the meeting concluded, she thanked Sarah for her service and for her willingness to speak up on behalf of other contractors. Morrison promised that Sarah's recommendations would be seriously considered as new policies were developed. She asked if Sarah would be willing to serve on an advisory committee that was being formed. Sarah left the Pentagon, feeling energized and hopeful. She had come to Washington thinking she would simply share her story, but instead, she had been given an opportunity to influence how the entire Department of Defense approached civilian-military cooperation. It was a responsibility she did not take lightly. She was determined to represent the interests of all contractors who served quietly and professionally in difficult conditions around the world. The flight back to Afghanistan gave Sarah time to reflect on her trip and everything that had happened since her collapse 3 months earlier. Her life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. She had gone from being an invisible contractor doing routine inspections to someone whose story was inspiring changes in military policy. It was surreal and sometimes overwhelming, but Sarah remained grounded in her core purpose, serving the Marines who put their lives on the line every day. When Sarah arrived back at her base in Afghanistan, she was greeted like a returning hero. Marines who had heard about her conference presentation wanted to know all about Washington and the people she had met. Lieutenant Rodriguez, recently promoted to captain, hosted a welcome-back dinner in her honor. Sarah shared stories from her trip and talked about the policy discussions she had participated in, emphasizing that real change was possible when people listened to each other and worked together. Colonel Harrison called Sarah to his office the day after her return. He had received a message from General Morrison thanking him for recommending Sarah for the conference and informing him that several of her suggestions were being fast-tracked for implementation. Harrison told Sarah that she was making a difference that extended far beyond their base, that he was proud to have her on his team. But the colonel also had other news. He was being reassigned to a new command in 6 months, and he wanted to know if Sarah would consider extending her contract and staying with the unit. He explained that continuity in safety operations was crucial, and that Sarah's expertise and the relationships she had built were invaluable. Sarah did not need time to think about it. She agreed immediately. This base, these Marines, had become her family, and she could not imagine leaving them. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled back into her routine. She performed inspections, trained new contractors who arrived to support expanding operations, and continued to build relationships with Marines throughout the base. But there was a new dimension to her work now. She was more aware of the broader impact of what she did, of how her example was influencing how civilian contractors were perceived and treated. Throughout the military, Sarah also began mentoring younger contractors, sharing the lessons she had learned about building trust and credibility with military personnel. She taught them that respect had to be earned through competence and dedication, not demanded based on position or credentials. She showed them how to communicate effectively with service members from different backgrounds and ranks. She emphasized the importance of never compromising on safety, even when facing pressure to cut corners or speed up processes. One of Sarah's mentees was a young man named Daniel Torres, brother of Private Amanda Torres. Daniel had been inspired by his sister's stories about Sarah and had applied for a contracting position specifically hoping to work with her. Sarah took him under her wing, teaching him everything she knew about vehicle safety systems, communication protocols, and the countless other details that made up her job. The story of Sarah Mitchell, the civilian contractor who passed out while ensuring Marine safety and awoke to 500 Marines celebrating her valor, became a legend told throughout the military. It reminded service members to value the contributions of everyone on their team. It inspired contractors to approach their work with dedication and pride. And it showed the world that heroism came in many forms. That sometimes the greatest courage was simply showing up every day and refusing to compromise on the things that mattered most. Daniel proved to be an excellent student, absorbing information quickly and showing the same attention to detail that had made Sarah so successful. Watching him develop his skills, Sarah realized that her legacy would extend beyond her own service. She was helping to create a new generation of contractors who understood that their work was about more than just completing tasks and collecting paychecks. It was about honoring the trust that military personnel placed in them and protecting lives through diligence and expertise. 1 year after the ceremony that had changed her life, Sarah stood once again at Mitchell Gate, the checkpoint that now bore her name. The permanent plaque had been installed months earlier, and Sarah still felt a surge of emotion every time she saw it. The inscription read, "Mitchell Gate, named in honor of Sarah Mitchell, whose dedication to Marine safety exemplifies the highest standards of civilian service. Her vigilance saves lives." Marines passing through the gate often stopped to read the plaque, and new arrivals always asked about the story behind it. Sarah had become something of a legend on the base, though she remained as humble and focused on her work as ever. She had completed her contract extension and signed on for another year, unable to imagine being anywhere else while Marines still needed her. Expertise. The base had grown significantly over the past year, with new units rotating in and expanded operations requiring more personnel and equipment. Sarah's responsibilities had grown as well. She now supervised a team of 5 contractors, all trained in her methods and committed to her standards. Together, they ensured that every vehicle, every piece of equipment, every safety system met the highest specifications before Marines went outside the wire. Captain Rodriguez, now serving as the base executive officer, remained one of Sarah's closest friends and strongest advocates. They met weekly to review safety reports and discuss any concerns that had arisen. Rodriguez often told Sarah that she had fundamentally changed the culture of the base, creating an environment where safety was valued rather than resented, where thoroughness was praised rather than criticized. One afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A Marine sergeant from a different base had requested permission to meet with her during a supply run to her installation. When they met, the sergeant introduced himself as Marcus Thompson and explained that he had been at the ceremony a year earlier. What Sarah did not know was that Thompson had been struggling with depression and questioning his purpose. In the military at that time, Thompson told Sarah that watching her ceremony and hearing her story had changed his perspective completely. He realized that meaning and purpose could be found in service of any kind. That dedication and excellence mattered regardless of whether anyone was watching or recognizing it. Inspired by her example, Thompson had refocused his energy on his duties as a logistics sergeant, finding fulfillment in ensuring that Marines had what they needed to complete their missions safely. The sergeant had recently been promoted and had received recognition from his commanding officer for his outstanding work. He had traveled to Sarah's base specifically to thank her and to let her know that she had saved his life in a way that had nothing to do with vehicle inspections or safety equipment. Sometimes, he explained, people needed to see examples of dedication and purpose to remember why their own service mattered. Sarah was deeply moved by Thompson's visit. She had never imagined that the ceremony could have such a profound impact on someone she had never met. It reminded her that influence often extended far beyond what we could see or measure. That living according to our values could touch lives in unexpected ways. She spent 2 hours talking with Thompson, sharing her own struggles and doubts, and encouraging him to continue serving with the same renewed sense of purpose he had described as months continued to pass. Sarah's influence grew in ways both large and small. The Department of Defense implemented several of her policy recommendations, creating new programs to integrate civilian contractors more effectively into military operations. Her training methods were adopted by other contracting companies and became standard practice across multiple theaters of operation. Articles about her appeared in military publications, highlighting the importance of recognizing excellence in all forms. But perhaps Sarah's greatest impact was on the individual Marines she continued to serve every day. She had been present for dozens of deployments, seeing units arrive fresh and idealistic, watching them mature through the challenges of combat operations, and saying goodbye as they rotated home. Each unit carried stories about Safety Sarah, about the contractor who cared so much that she had literally worked herself, conscious trying to protect them. Private Amanda Torres. Now a corporal was preparing to complete her deployment and return to the United States. On her last day at the base, she sought out Sarah for a final conversation. Torres told her that serving alongside Sarah had shown her what leadership really looked like. It was not about rank or authority, but about competence, dedication, and genuine care for others. Torres had decided to pursue a career in the Marines, hoping to eventually become an officer who would lead with the same values Sarah had demonstrated. The two women embraced, both fighting back tears. Sarah told Torres that she was proud of the Marine she had become and confident that she would make a positive difference wherever her career took her. Torres promised to stay in touch and to carry forward the lessons she had learned. As Sarah watched the young woman walk away, she thought about how service created these connections. These bonds that transcended backgrounds and circumstances. Sergeant Cooper, whose life Sarah had saved with her body armor inspection, was also preparing to leave. He had re-enlisted and was being assigned to a recruiting station back in the United States. Cooper told Sarah that he planned to tell her story to every potential recruit he met, to help them understand that military service was about more than combat and glory. It was about dedication, attention to detail, taking care of the people around you. Cooper presented Sarah with a gift from his entire squad. It was a custom-made challenge coin, a military tradition where specially designed coins were given to recognize exceptional service. One side featured the Marine Corps emblem, while the other side showed Mitchell Gate and bore the inscription Guardian Angel. Cooper explained that every member of his squad carried one of these coins as a reminder of the importance of doing things right, even when it was difficult or inconvenient. As Sarah's second year at the base progressed, she began thinking about her future. She loved her work and the Marines she served with, but she also recognized that her influence could extend further. General Morrison had continued to reach out, asking Sarah to consider taking a position at the Pentagon where she could work on contractor policy full-time. It was a tempting offer, one that would allow her to effect change on a massive scale. But Sarah was torn. The work she did here, the daily interactions with Marines, the knowledge that her inspections directly protected lives these things, provided a sense of purpose and fulfillment that no policy position could match. She spoke with Colonel Harrison, now a newly promoted brigadier general preparing for his own transfer, seeking his advice. Harrison listened thoughtfully and then offered his perspective. The general told Sarah that leadership required knowing when to step back and let others carry forward the work you had started. She had trained excellent contractors who could maintain her standards. She had changed the culture of the base so that safety was embedded in everything they did. And she had an opportunity to influence how hundreds of thousands of contractors and millions of service members interacted across the entire Department of Defense. Sometimes, Harrison suggested, the most impactful service required leaving behind work. We love to take on new challenges. Sarah spent weeks wrestling with the decision. She walked Mitchell Gate late at night, ran her hands over the familiar vehicles in the motor pool, and talked with Marines about their experiences and perspectives. Finally, she made her choice. She would accept the Pentagon position, but only on one condition. She would spend at least 1 week every quarter visiting bases where contractors worked alongside military personnel, maintaining that direct connection to the field that gave her work meaning and credibility. When Sarah announced her decision to leave the base, the response was bittersweet. Marines were sad to see her go, but proud that she would be representing them and all. Contractors at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Plans immediately began for a farewell ceremony. Though Sarah insisted it be much smaller and more informal than the event that had honored her a year and a half earlier, the farewell gathering took its place on a warm evening. With Marines past and present attending, several who had rotated back to the United States flew to Afghanistan at their own expense to say goodbye. The ceremony featured speeches from Captain Rodriguez, Brigadier General Harrison, and several Marines whose lives had been directly impacted by Sarah's work. But the most moving moment came when every Marine present, over 300 of them, signed a giant banner that would hang in Sarah's new Pentagon office. The banner read simply, "From the Marines of Afghanistan to our guardian angel, Semper Fi."